Hello, everyone. So, today we're going to talk about the two very important forms of learning. We have the classical and the operant conditioning. So, let us move on to the classical conditioning first. So here we have a slide on classical conditioning, which is very clearly depicting, that what actually happens in classical conditioning. So basically, this form of learning, if we come to see, was firstly investigated by Ivan P. Pavlov, and he was quite interested in studying the physiology of digestion in case of dogs. So, of course, during his studies and the research and a lot of experiments that he was performing on dogs, what he noticed was that the dogs, they continue to secrete saliva as soon as they saw an empty plate in front of them, of course, of food being served. The fact that the plate was empty still sort of elicited, the secretion of saliva. So that was something noticed by Ivan P. Pavlov. And as we all know, as a matter of fact, that saliva secretion is but a reflexive response. So, reflexive response is something which is very involuntary, very automatic, something that's not in our control, absolutely natural. And we all have experienced this, and we experience it every day, saliva secretion. So, of course, then very clearly, he had actually designed an experiment because he wanted to understand this process in detail, and he made use of dogs once again. So coming to the first phase of his experiment, he took a dog and placed it in a box, actually, and of course, harnessed or tied the dog then. And the dog was left there for some time, and this procedure was repeated a number of times on different days. And meanwhile, of course, what he did was that a little surgery was conducted where they took a tube and inserted one end of the tube, in the dog's jaw, and the other end of the tube was actually put in a measuring glass. Now, this measuring glass was actually responsible for basically measuring the saliva, you know. So, one end of it was inserted in the dog's jaw, and the other end of it was straight into the measuring glass. So, this was in a way measuring the saliva of the dog, and that is why the surgery was done. Now, in the second phase, what they did was, of course, the dog was kept in the box only, but absolutely hungry. And then, of course, later a bell was sounded, and immediately after the ringing of the bell, the food, which was in the form of meat powder, was served to the dog. you know so then, of course, the dog was absolutely allowed to even eat the food. And for the next couple of days, the same thing, the same procedure, was repeated. So every time when the meat powder had to be presented, right before that, there was a sound of the bell made. And after the sound of the bell, only after that, the meat powder was presented or the food was presented. So basically, after a number of such trials, in a way, the dog actually got quite used to it, or he actually became quite habitual, to the presentation of food after the ringing of the bell. So he became very used to it, very habitual to it. He in a way learned this also, that when the bell will ring, the food will be presented after that. So, but of course, after a number of trials, then came the test trial, in which, of course, everything was the same. The bell, of course, it did ring, but after the ringing of the bell, there was no food brought to the dog. But what was noticed by Pavlov was that the dog still continued to salivate. Now, this was because he was expecting, very clearly expecting, that the food would come, but actually the food did not come. This is what happened in the test trial. So basically, the association formed between the bell and the food somehow, because of a number of trials, it somehow resulted in the acquisition, or you can say the learning, of a new response by the dog. And this new response, of course, the new response that was learned by the dog was nothing but, of course, the salivation, that was being done upon the sound of the bell. So, as soon as the bell rang, the dog started salivating and he learned this response of salivation. He sort of was conditioned in a way to respond in a way of salivating, to the sound of the bell. So this kind of learning or this kind of conditioning happened, when there was an association that was made between the bell and the food, because each time when the bell rang, the food was brought. It kept repeating, and the dog got used to it, got habitual to it. And even when the food was actually not brought, he still continued to salivate because the conditioning had already taken place. He had already become quite used to it, quite habitual to it. So he learned this response of salivation upon, the sound of the bell. So this clearly is, of course, conditioning. So if we come to see, you know, food is actually unconditioned stimulus. Now, when we talk about unconditioned stimulus, definitely this kind of stimulus, is very naturally and very automatically going to trigger a specific response. So this kind of unconditioned stimulus, of course, it's going to trigger, or maybe it's going to elicit a response in us, but in a very natural manner, in a very automatic manner. So as soon as we look at the food, our mouth begins to water, and we have seen that happening in case of even dogs. So as soon as they see food or food is brought in front of them, they start salivating, and it happens very naturally. So for this reason, because the food is eliciting very naturally, a response of salivation, for this reason, the food is an unconditioned stimulus, and the response that it is eliciting, of course, that is also happening very naturally, and that is why it's called the unconditioned response. And of course, after conditioning, after the learning, or after becoming quite habitual, after repeated trials, when the dog gets to know that after ringing of the bell, definitely food will come, he's become very conditioned, to the presentation of food. And upon just hearing the sound of bell after n number of trials, the dog still salivates. But in this case, of course, after conditioning or after learning, the salivation, it started to kind of occur even in the presence of just the sound of the bell. So in those cases, of course, the bell is the conditioned stimulus. Now here the bell becomes the conditioned stimulus because it is conditioning the dog to salivate. That when the bell will ring, the food will be brought. So it's like a conditioning here. So that is why the bell is the conditioned stimulus. And definitely the saliva then that will be secreted by the dog is going to be a conditioned response. So this kind of conditioning is called classical conditioning, because after the conditioning, the dog will salivate upon hearing the bell. So it's happening because the bell is ringing. So that is why it becomes a conditioned response. But initially, of course, before conditioning, we come to see there was no bell, nothing. And the response took place very naturally. The dog salivated very naturally. And this natural trigger that took place, it happened because of food, which is the unconditioned stimulus. The bell is the conditioned stimulus. The response that it actually elicits, it becomes the conditioned response. that happens after conditioning very clearly. So, this classical conditioning is also called the SS form of learning because in this one stimulus, which is the sound of the bell, it becomes a signal, signal for another stimulus. So, bell will become the signal for food, you know, and one stimulus, it signifies the possible occurrence of another stimulus, you know so this is how basically we can really understand, the classical conditioning, how it basically works. What is the CS here? Of course, the CS is the bell, which is the conditioned stimulus. The UCS is the unconditioned stimulus, and that is the food, you know. So, of course, before, if we see, we do have the food, which is the unconditioned stimulus, before we actually begin, and whatever is going to be the response is going to be very natural, and that's what is going to make the response the unconditioned response, which is the salivation, you know. Of course, during the experiment, we see that there will be a sound of the bell, and then the food will be brought. In that case, the sound of the bell does become the conditioned stimulus, and the food will continue to be the unconditioned stimulus. But the response during will still be unconditioned response. Why? Because the dog is still trying to understand the role of the bell. He's still trying to become habitual to it. But still, the response elicited by the food is going to be very, very natural. It's going to be triggered in a very automatic and natural way because the dog is still trying to become habitual, still trying to learn or get conditioned to the sound of the bell. So, then, of course, once the conditioning has been done, of course, after that, definitely the sound of the bell will be conditioned stimulus, and even if the food is not brought, even if the food is not brought after the ringing of the bell, once the conditioning has been done or the learning has been done, then the saliva that will be secreted will be the conditioned response, which is the CR, you know. So, very clearly, we are talking about what's happening before the conditioning. Of course, during the experiment, in the process of still trying to learn a new behavior, still trying to learn to acquire a new response. And of course, what's going to happen after the learning is already done or after the conditioning has already taken place? What's going to happen after that? That's what we are trying to understand in the classical conditioning. So, with this, we close the classical conditioning. Thank you so much.